I'd like to welcome everyone to the JCPA Delegates Assembly on Policing and Public Safety. I'd like to remind everyone to mute your audio and block your video during the presentations. My name is Michael Fromm. I'm chair of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. It's great to have almost 190 people registered today and more than 80 JCRCs and national agencies represented on today's Zoom call. The Delegates Assembly is the highest deliberative public policy body in the community relations field and brings a network of JCRCs and national agencies together to grapple with the pressing issues of the day and to educate, advocate, and mobilize. The grievous killing of George Floyd and the national response has sparked the most significant conversation around systemic racism in America since the 1960s. And it came during the COVID-19 pandemic that highlighted racial and economic disparities that exist in our country today. That these issues have been raised to such a level is a clear call to action for our network. JCPA and the Community Relations Network must be a leading voice in the Jewish community on ending racism, hate, and bigotry. We have a strong history on civil rights and have spent the past 4 years educating and advocating on criminal justice reform. We are ready to engage in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement to work for revisioning public safety in our communities and our nation. I want to thank everyone for making this session a priority today. And I want to thank our criminal justice co-chairs, Faye Taxman and Bruce Turnbull, for working with Melanie Roth-Gorelick and the JCPA staff to create an important program with tremendous speakers who will help us take a deep dive into these important concerns. Now I'd like to turn the program over to David Bohm, JCPA's Policy Advisory Chair. David?
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you've taken the time to attend this very important Delegate Assembly meeting. Particularly since the killing of George Floyd, we've been asked to take positions and engage in more substantive level on policing and public safety. In many ways, this is very different from the criminal justice reform work in which JCPA and many of our JCRCs have been engaging over the last several years. JCPA has been very active on the federal level, working with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and in our national coalitions on this topic. We helped to develop and signed on to an 8-point platform of priorities that should be included in any federal legislative package. We submitted written testimony in support of this platform to several congressional hearings. We also passed a JCPA resolution on restorative justice in February, although as I mentioned, it does not address many areas or many of the issues which deal with systemic racism in policing that are now being raised in the public square. While JCPA is advocating on the federal level for changes, most policing takes place at the state and local level. So the positive change can only come about by involvement with our state and local governments and police forces. The current public discourse and advocacy is being framed not only about making changes to the way police interact with the public, particularly minority communities, but also around a fundamental re-examination of what we need to do to enhance and deliver public safety within our communities to everyone, regardless of color, creed, gender, or religion. We in the Jewish community, who have relied on police to protect our institutions, particularly since 9/11, will have to balance such protection against what is necessary to dismantle institutional racism within policing and to ensure that the public safety needs of all communities, particularly communities of color, are met in a fair and equitable manner. For many of us in the community relations field, this is a new issue, particularly at the local level. For many of us, it's been hard to sift through new terms and voluminous media reports to understand the policy issues and the proposals that are being put forward by advocates in this area. JCPA has organized this program to help you understand and make the case for engagement on these issues and provide you with the knowledge and a roadmap you need to have to be at the table where decisions are made in your state and local communities.
Good afternoon, welcome. And thank you so much for joining us for this momentous discussion. I am Dr. Andrea Boyles, the moderator for this panel. And author of 2 books, You Can't Stop the Revolution, Community Disorder and Social Ties in Post-Ferguson America, as well as Race, Place, and Suburban Policing, Too Close for Comfort. I am humbled for having been asked to lead this event, and more specifically, am delighted to be a part of the efforts by the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and this amazing panel, as you and we together move to learn and advance dialogue and understanding of citizen-police relations in the heat of a 21st century Black movement. For context, and so that you better understand my work in frames of reference, I am a sociologist and critical criminologist, and more directly, I am an expert on Black citizen-police conflict and researcher who years prior to Mike Brown Jr.'s killing had been accounting for mostly poor Black suburban experiences with the police in an annexed community, annexed predominantly Black community, on the heels of decades of racial tension, the death of a Black citizen, several retaliatory killings of police officers, in fact, a city council rampage, and DOJ intervention just minutes from Ferguson. My work continued and even overlapped in many respects, as only a few years later, across town, it would be that I find myself on the ground accounting for the paramilitarized police units in Black collective action immediately following Mike Brown Jr.'s murder in Ferguson. It had been only a few hours in, meaning before the crime scene tape even had come down, and the world, prior to the world learning of this shooting in this place we all have come to know so well as Ferguson. To date, Black mobilization in Ferguson and throughout the St. Louis region. For many of you that may not be aware, Ferguson is located in the suburbs of St. Louis. So throughout that region, this region has been the longest sustained Black action, and what I speak to and reference as the template for 21st century Black resistance up to the present. I attended to this and documented the first 400 days and years thereafter of resistance, and consequently even acquired my own experiences on the ground and on the receiving end of repeated full-on state violent responses. And so as we begin or continue thinking about and talking really about how we as a nation arrived at this place, how we came to this crossroads, this very critical place in time, it is important to note, or really I challenge you to keep in mind that this movement, the Black movement, particularly on the heels of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so forth, is part of a continuum. The Black effort, in fact, exists as a collective. We, the Black community, are not a monolith, and the work to advance social change has been and continues to be ongoing by many, be it individually or as groups or across numerous grassroots. Black folks aim to protect Black lives is broad and far greater than policing or the work of any one organization. We have many organizing factions as a greater extensive effort. And so it is through this lens, yes, what we know, or at least should know and understand concerning the role of police, but also how they police and what that looks like and means across communities. In other words, those actual everyday tasks, actions, exchanges, and or experiences that has led to the expansion of this Black movement, particularly in deeply entrenched debates concerning reforming. And it is on that note, as you're keeping all those things in mind, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our great panelists, Drs. Robert Brown and Alex Vitale. Did I say that correctly? Great, excellent. And so I will briefly introduce them and then give them space and opportunity to have to enter the conversation. Dr. Robert A. Brown is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Criminal Justice at North Carolina Central University. Dr. Brown's research focuses on street level interactions between police officers and citizens, the influence of race and gender on criminal justice processing, and the impact of intermediate sanctions and problem-solving courts on rehabilitation and criminal justice processing. Dr. Alex S. Vitale is professor of sociology and coordinator of policing and social justice project at Brooklyn College and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He has spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consulting both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. Professor Vitale is the author of 2 books, City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, as well as The End of Policing. And so to begin, I ask each of you to take 10 minutes each and share your research and perspectives on the police and the role of policing in 21st century America. You can begin, either one of you who wants to go first.
Go ahead, Robert.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to use these few minutes to go over 4 broad points. And I think that that will be a good segue into some of the things I believe Alex will talk about. These 4 points are going to focus on the police role when it comes to coercive force, training and standards, community policing and events such as 9/11 and mass shootings since the 1980s, and the definition of police officers in the context of being good or bad. I'm a native of Washington, D.C., and if we were sitting in an introduction to criminal justice class and we started to talk about policing, one of the things I would tell you, the audience, is we would go into it, why do we have the police? And people would talk about to enforce the law, to provide service, to promote public safety. And I would then turn the conversation to, it's much simpler than that and much more complicated than that. We have the police because, as some policing scholars, and Egon Bittner and Clockers would note, things happen and something needs to be done about the things that happen. And we need someone who can come in and do something about that thing that is happening and do it immediately. Growing up for me in Washington, D.C., that was my grandmother. In the 5600 block of Kansas Avenue, my grandmother's span of control was phenomenal. My grandmother could come outside, and if anyone, and I'm not just talking about kids, adults, I've seen my grandmother get grown men to stop drinking in the streets and gambling, to move some things. I've seen my grandmother come out and with some words stop fights. As a young child, I've definitely been a part of my grandmother stopping me from doing something inappropriate and the other kids in the neighborhood. And my grandmother, Rosalie Anderson, she was powerful. But she was a rare individual, and at best, her power was limited to that block. Really the face of the street that we lived on in the block. If my grandmother were to go 2 blocks over and try to do the exact same thing, people would look at her first as if, who are you? They would not pay attention to her. And my grandmother probably would have gotten into a very ugly confrontation with someone who would not have respected her or listened to her. Because my grandmother and people like my grandmother lack the infamous or else power. And that's what police officers have. That's what we rely on with police officers. Whether it's the immortal officer friendly or officer street justice, whether an officer is asking someone to do something and they're doing so politely and professionally and nicely, or they come in and they start to give strong commands, directives, they're very aggressive. They have the infamous or else. Would you please stop doing this? Or else I will make you stop doing it. And that comes from the reality that the police can engage in non-negotiable coercive force. I believe Alex is going to talk about this later in the context of violence, but we need to recognize that the police have the ability to engage in non-negotiable coercive force. So when we call the police and we bring the police into a situation, whether they start off very friendly and professional or they come in hard charging, there's always the backbone of or else. And they can use up to lethal force to bring about an immediate resolution to a situation. The threat of force or the actual use of force may not be the best way to resolve a situation. They might actually be wrong, but in that moment in time, they have the ability to use that force, and we potentially can review that situation after the fact. That is part of the historic role of policing. That is important today. When someone calls the police because someone has allegedly committed a crime, and the police, the encounter evolves in a way where they use lethal force, that is something that we have empowered them to do, and we have given them that power for a long time. Second thing I would like to talk about is training and standards. When you understand the history of policing, and policing scholars often talk about policing in terms of eras, that we have three. Some people debate, are we in a fourth era of policing? The political era, and if you've ever seen the movie The Gangs of New York, that's a portrayal, a good portrayal of the political era and the information we have from that, from big city policing to the professional or reform era, then the community policing era, and some argue that we are now in a homeland security era. Others argue that we are just in an extended period of the community policing era. I want to focus for a few moments on the professional era of policing, when we transitioned away from the political era, where policing was very corrupt and service-oriented, to the reform era or professional era, where we started to see standards and trainings become very common in policing. We have a long history of trying to change and improve policing through the use of training and standards. And it has been successful in some ways, but it has surely not been a cure-all fix to the ills that we see in policing. Oftentimes, our training and our standards are playing catch-up. We develop new training and we develop new standards because we find out that our current standards and training were inadequate to deal with certain problems. It's kind of like the making of laws. Someone did not do it, or the existing laws were not effective, so we make a new one. And we make a new one by just saying we'll do more training. And it is not uncommon that that training misses the mark for what we are trying to accomplish. Furthermore, and more troubling, we do not have a good history of evaluating training. We have a strong history of coming up with trainings and targeting things that we want law enforcement officers to do and law enforcement agencies to comply with, but we do not have a good record of going back and reviewing those things for the sake of reviewing them and improvement. At most, our review tends to be, we have to look at it again because it wasn't working, and we found out it was not working because there was some crisis. Another problem with the training and standards phenomenon is it has perpetuated the myth of uniformity in policing. Policing at the local level looks very similar, but the reality is policing happens at the local level. What is going on in a police department in Connecticut may not be the same thing as what's going on in Colorado. When you compare Detroit to Durham to Dallas, the police departments have some similar requirements. They're all bound by the Constitution. There are, again, standards that most agencies embrace. But this is where we run into, one police department allows chokeholds or above the neck restraints, another police department does not. And when we get into these conversations about problems with policing, an incident that hits the national news, we start to see that, we have this national problem. This is a problem that's common in police departments. And it may not be. It may actually be more of a problem in that particular agency as opposed to another agency. Community policing, briefly. And also, forgive me, we have the problem with training and standards that officers develop a mentality where if their actions are not against law or agency policy, that makes it okay. One of the things that you have to understand about policing and police officers is that they operate from if it's not against the law or if it's not against agency policy, then you cannot say that I've done something wrong. So we've become very rule-oriented in policing to a point where maybe we don't recognize as well as we should things that are problematic regardless of the rules. Quickly, I want to talk about community policing. Community policing was a distortion of social disorganization theory, and broken windows was a distortion of social disorganization theory. It increased the call for police vigor in encounters, paying attention to the little things, and it expanded officer use of discretion to a point where not just in urban communities where people think crime is concentrated the most and is the most dangerous. Community policing and focusing on the little things expanded to rural communities and suburban communities. And we've seen policing evolve since the 1980s, where officers are hyper-vigilant. They pay attention to the little things, and everyone with a heightened sense of danger and risk. Mass shootings and September 11th have just made that even more entrenched in policing. And we're now in an era where we've accepted that the police should approach every situation as a high-risk situation that could result in mass casualties. Lastly, and I know I'm over my time, I'll just take a few seconds. Unfortunately, we define good police officers by their status of not being bad police officers. This creates a false dichotomy, and this brings out some of the worst aspects of police solidarity. I'll end with there because I think we'll cycle back. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bobby. That was great. Can I have my students tune in to that first lecture? So, you know, I think Scott earlier laid out a good framework for thinking about the current defund movement. And Robert's given us some baseline thinking about what the nature of policing is. And what I thought I would talk a little bit about is the limits of police reform as we normally think about it, and what we might be able to do instead. So Minneapolis was really held up as a kind of shining star of police reform. They embraced a huge long list of reforms that had been proposed by the Obama administration in its Task Force on 21st Century Policing report. And while no department implements everything, and there's always foot dragging and you know, a lack of complete buy-in, Minneapolis Police Department issued a report in 2018 that detailed all these innovative training, oversight, and community responsiveness initiatives. The officers that were involved in the killing of George Floyd had implicit bias training, had de-escalation training, had mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras, were part of a system of identifying officers with complaints, a kind of early warning system, and had been given specific training instructing them in their duty to intervene in a situation where they witness an officer engage in misconduct, had an affirmative obligation to intervene, and it made no difference. None of that training, none of those reforms prevented someone from being killed for an allegation of misspending a $20 possibly counterfeit bill. And I can tell you, I once tried to spend a counterfeit $10 bill unknowingly, and no police were called. No one was tackled to the ground. The proprietor simply asked me if I had another method of payment. So let's look a little bit at some of these reforms that have been proposed in a little bit more detail. In the new Democratic House bill for police reform included more money for implicit bias training. Now, we understand that there's a problem in racially disparate outcomes in American policing. Outcomes in terms of arrests and use of force and complaints, racial profiling in traffic stops and pedestrian stops. The question is, can we solve this problem through an intervention like implicit bias training? So implicit bias training assumes that individual or has provided research that shows that in the aggregate, when we group a large number of people together, and we show them images of different colored people, and we give them little buttons to push, that measured in little microseconds, we can find some preference for lighter skinned faces over darker skinned faces. And that's pretty well established at the aggregate level. However, at the individual level, they have found completely inconsistent results here. And more importantly, they've never really been able to find a connection between how someone scores on the test and their actual behavior in the world. And finally, there's no evidence that this training actually changes officer behavior in any meaningful way. And really, how could this be the solution? Because it assumes that the problems of racism in American policing and racially disparate outcomes are the result of completely unconscious and unintentional decision-making by individual officers in their discretionary everyday policing. So the first problem with this is that we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. When we look for it, we find it in the chat rooms, in the email threads, on the Facebook pages, sometimes from the official statements of police union leaders, or their willingness to defend and cover up the racist behavior of individual officers. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen officers in a whole list of cities get fired because they were found to have engaged in overtly racist behavior, caught on body cameras or unaware that they were on the radio or something like that. So we have officers who are part of white supremacist groups. You know, this is a pervasive problem in American policing. However, even if we did not have that, and certainly in many large cities, we even have a majority of officers who are non-white in New York and Los Angeles and Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. and Detroit and Baltimore. So how are we to understand the problem of race in these circumstances? Well, the problem then has to be understood as a problem of structural racism. And this is a problem that extends beyond policing itself. It's located in the political decision to turn every problem in Black and brown communities into problems to be managed by the police. To frame problems of homelessness and inadequate mental health care and failed schools and substance abuse problems and involvement in Black markets because of economic precarity, to define all those as criminal problems that can only be addressed through policing. And this decision, even when police behave in a proper manner, reproduces and exacerbates racial inequality in the United States. Because in whiter, wealthier, leafy suburbs, these problems are not turned over to the police to manage. They're managed by families, they're managed by medical interventions, and these problems don't even exist in many cases because these communities produce safety out of economic security. Stable housing, stable employment, stable access to high quality education, high quality health care means that they don't have these policed problems. And so a totally non-discriminatory, unbiased, low-level drug arrest is going to ruin some young person's life regardless. It doesn't matter how lawfully and properly implemented it is. The problem is our elected officials have said, instead of actually trying to address these problems in low-income and non-white communities, and let's be clear, in a lot of parts of the United States, in rural areas like Ohio and West Virginia and Kansas, we're also talking about poor white communities that are highly over-policed and subject to police violence and mass criminalization. So instead of actually addressing these problems, and of course the burden there's always that extra burden for Black communities, indigenous communities, Latino communities. So instead of addressing these problems of mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, mass economic precarity that drives people into black markets of drug selling and sex work and stolen goods, instead of addressing those things, they've been turned over to the police to manage. And then when the policing generates violence and mass criminalization, then our political leaders, say, well, we need to take the edges off of that by giving them some training, by weeding out a few problematic officers, by having a little bit more transparency, by tightening up some use of force rules. These are what we call procedural justice reforms that are designed to restore the public's trust in the police so the police can get back to doing what they're doing. But the problem is what they're doing is inherently problematic. We don't need to give narcotics units anti-bias training. We need to have a complete rethink about why we've turned real drug problems in our society over to the police to manage rather than over to public health authorities to manage. So let me stop there, and I look forward to continuing the conversation this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Moving forward, and actually you both have answered so many different things until I'm sorting through now. We've got questions coming in from the audience and some that I had prepared myself. So I'm going to sort of just try to pick through a little bit. You both have talked about the politicization of law enforcement. And so police, for many of you that may not think of it that way, is really the most visible arm of the local government. And so they are the part of the government people are likely to come to encounters with and have unfavorable encounters with, and it goes hand in hand. When people are also having unfavorable experiences with the local government, they likewise tend to have that with local law enforcement. And so I will sort of further that and ask you, how then, you all talked about reform, or the problem, so to speak, with reforming. So then how can mayors, let's say, even if it was going to be a thing, right? This idea of reform rather than defunding or abolition, if it was even going to be a thing, how could mayors, city council members, and other elected officials be held accountable to appoint police commissioners who will make changes necessary to change the culture of police departments? In other words, I guess if I cut short, it just sort of cut straight to it, how could it even be possible to address or have folks brought on that could make a cultural shift in the way necessary to service all populations fairly or justly, particularly Black populations, and have that happen through the ranks and accountability take place through the ranks? And so that could, yeah, either of you can go, and let's say maybe 3 minutes apiece.
Sure. So in some way, voting and being politically active, if we're talking about holding government officials accountable to things, it really is the more people have to vote. The people who are participating in the political process need to make sure that they bring about pressure, political pressure and voices, facilitate other people's voices, so that government officials, again, at the local level, understand what good policing means to that community. I want to, Alex's discussion brought this up to my mind, which I've shared with other folks before. Policing is like an old car, and we come up with things like implicit bias training. So I saw someone ask a question about problem-solving policing. We add body-worn cameras. We take duct tape and we add a new thing on to the old framed car. And we think that adding that new thing on has somehow changed the car. And it doesn't. It's just a nice add-on. And we get into this bad narrative of, oh, policing has changed, when no, we've just added on a nice new bauble to a broken down car. So I think that people have to understand that at some level, we really do have to talk about reform to a point of breaking down the car, not how can we add something else onto the car and make this part of it shiny or different.
Yeah, I agree with that the car is really broken, and it's being, we're trying to use it for everything, especially in certain communities. And we need to quit trying to fix the car and start taking that car apart. And we can do this in pretty concrete ways. We can start by identifying those areas where we have clear evidence that policing is actually counterproductive, and where we have real evidence-based alternatives to using police. I think we need to get police out of schools. We need to get them out of the mental health business. We need to get them out of the homelessness business. I think ultimately we need to get them out of the drug business and the sex work business. We need to look at community-based interventions that can address those problems without relying on violence workers, which, as we were discussing before, is really what this essence of policing is. And I'm just so pessimistic in my years doing this work that we're going to fix the culture of policing. When our politicians tell police to wage a war on crime and a war on drugs and a war on gangs and a war on disorder and a war on immigrants and a war on terror, they're not going to be nice. They're not going to be friendly. There's going to be violence, and it's going to be racially disproportionate. And so I often say about my own work, it's not really about police accountability as much as it's about political accountability. So how do we so it's not about mayors holding police commissioners accountable. It's about the public holding mayors and city councils accountable. And that's exactly what this defund movement is about. It's about people going to budget hearings, lobbying city council members, running people for mayor. It's very concrete local politics, demanding a shift in budget priorities that will help turn the tide against, just decades of disinvestment and criminalization of our already often most vulnerable communities.
Okay, so then let me ask you this, because I keep hearing from you both that in essence, you're speaking to, so there's no quick fix, right, to law enforcement. And there's certainly an accountability is needing to occur at the political level, meaning it can't start at the lower ranks of law enforcement. It must begin far beyond those agencies. So I guess my question would then be, why are people people seem to be very afraid of this idea of defunding, right? This idea of the word in and of itself, abolition. And so there's that dispute, that debate. Where is that coming from? Can you speak to that, or sort of explain to help perhaps our understanding and how defunding works, or what that means in concert to fixing or breaking down and restoring and rebuilding these parts and pieces as associated with abolition even?
Maybe I'll start on this one. So, Scott earlier gave us a little bit of an outline of this. Defund the police was not really a term that was in common usage before the last 2 months, even though there were movements underway all across the country. And I've been going to 20, 25 cities a year the last few years, working with these different groups. They're trying to shift resources from criminalization to community development. It's really that simple. And this is a movement that's been led by people who have experienced profound lack of safety. This is a community safety movement, led by people for whom the police have not been an adequate source of safety, for whom the police either were not working or were actually a source of danger for them, often made the situation worse. And they're trying to develop and have developed concrete alternatives so that we don't have to keep plowing every new dollar in the budget into policing, that we can put that money into very targeted, specific interventions, that we can develop community-based anti-violence centers, that we can put counselors back in schools, that we can create community-based mental health services, because these are the things that ultimately make communities safer, not relying on mass criminalization.
So another fundamental concept that I teach about policing and really the justice system as a whole. Criminal justice, the police, they are an extension of government. They are a government service. Whatever your government looks like, however your government is structured, that is going to influence significantly what that part of the justice system does. We have to, I hope to not insult anyone, but in all candor, we need everyone in our country to stop being intellectually lazy. Defund the police is not a new phenomenon. It's not a new term. People have been talking about this for years, particularly again at the local level. If you do thorough internet searches, you will find that there have been coalitions, groups in communities that have been calling for exactly what Alex laid out, a change in the way that justice is done. Some people have focused on the term justice reinvestment, but people have been talking about reshaping, redefining how our government provides public safety and services through the criminal justice system. We've been doing that for a while. We're just now in a time where the positive, people are paying more attention to that call, but people are also now distorting that call because they're hearing it and the shock of it. And no one can imagine a time without school resource officers or without officers, there being more police officers and officers having military grade equipment. I made the comparison, boy, imagine if someone said defund cell phone companies. We're gonna cut back on towers and coverage and stuff, and we're gonna cut back on cell phones. How many people go, oh my God, what would I do without my cell phone? How would I ever find my way from my house to this location if I did not have a portable computer telling me what to do? It's as if we all forgot the days of MapQuest. It's as if we all forgot the times when we paid attention to where we would go and read a map and we got from point A to point B without relying on computers and cell phones. We've made it a long way through the history of human civilization and in America without having police as we see them today, but we are so mentally resistant to thinking about policing being done another way. I think that the defund the policing call is a call for better government as it pertains to criminal justice. And people at the local level should have a voice in how their government is working for them. I think that it is an extreme to go to, we're talking about getting rid of, there are some people who are talking about abolishing the police and they do not want any police anywhere. Just like there are some people who want to abolish the federal government and they don't think that should exist. We don't discount our thoughts about democracy just because some people say they don't think the federal government should exist. We should not throw the baby out with the bathwater just because some people think, maybe we should remove the police, de-invest from the police handling all problems.
And so we have just a couple minutes left. And so I'm so sorry for the very many important questions that are coming in. We won't be able to take them all, not at least in this session, but we do see them. They're very important. And so, but I would ask you all in closing, a couple things that, I want to throw out. The defunding and abolition, again, it has been talked about at the local level, oftentimes in spaces of invisibility, particularly in a Black community, and is packaged differently. And so it doesn't, so there's a variation of words that have been used, or how far in to go. And so the idea is not that you wake up tomorrow and then there's like suddenly no law enforcement. That's not been you know, and so I think that is part of the fear too. This over reliance, and then thinking that we will wake up or in an hour, all departments will be like non-existent, right? And so I guess my question in closing is that, what do we do, or how do you, can you, the two of you, make the case then moving forward? We talked about all these things that have not worked, what will work, how then, because it can't be more of the same. It absolutely cannot be that. And so then how do people think about this, or what would you want people to know moving forward based on your research as the best route for processing these options and moving forward with a fundamentally different department, one after the other?
Well, I think, you know, we need to listen to the voices that are coming out of those communities that are experiencing the most profound public safety challenges, and for whom policing has been the only resource that's offered to them. And, you know, one of the bad dynamics we're in here is that for so long, these communities were told the only resource they can have is more police, so that they themselves began to ask for more police because that was the only thing on offer. And what's different today is that increasingly there are voices in these communities who understand that that's not the only possible way to approach these things. And we need to try to connect with those people, find out what they think will actually make their community safer, and try to support them in these budget battles. And that means that even if we don't live in that community, we still need to talk to our city council member who may be blocking these attempts because they think that police are the only possible thing that those people will understand. And it's up to us to rein in those politicians who represent us, who may not live in those same highly impacted communities. And that's really what's informed my work on this. And let me just say that those people who say abolish the police, even they, none of them who are actually involved in doing any actual organizing are saying that tomorrow there's some magical switch that they're going to flip and then there are no police. They understand that this is about a long-term process, a long-term vision, and they're trying to figure out how to get to a world where we don't need people with guns and cages for human beings to manage our problems. And frankly, I would like to live in a world like that too. So that is a vision that guides my thinking about how we start to get our way out of this mess. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just sent a message to the chat to everyone, the title of a book, Policing for the Future by David Bailey. I recommend that anyone who's very interested and who wants to go further into policing, that it's a book that you pick up. I also want to give a shameless plug to my co-panelist, Alex. If you have not read his piece on the 5 myths of policing, please do so. That is a very strong article and an important launching point if you're just getting started with this. And I say that because both David Bailey and Alex speak to this issue of we need to better understand policing, or more importantly, what it's not. Bailey's work talks about we need to engage in honest policing. And one of the central premises of his book is that we need to be honest that the police cannot prevent crime. Part of our problem in this discussion is our pursuit of eradicating crime, when that is never going to happen. Crime is always going to exist, and we are always going to pursue keeping it in balance or in check, keeping it to a minimum. I bring that up because one of the most important things that we need to do moving forward is stop blaming communities, in particular poor communities and communities of color, for the crime that happens in our neighborhood. There is this false equivalency that communities somehow have a responsibility to control all crime going on in their neighborhoods. And this is opening up a little bit the black on black crime myth and getting into, well, if communities would cooperate with the police and tell us who's doing what, there would be no problems. Crime is going to exist. We all hopefully want to keep it at a minimum. But if we think that the police are somehow going to be able to stop it from happening in the first place, we're never going to win. We're never going to make good progress. So I think that breaking down a lot of the myths of policing, and if more people understood the realities and limitations of the police, who they are and what they do, that would put us on a better path. And to maybe tie this back to one of our overarching themes in this discussion, we are currently in a space where we tolerate, legitimize the police being ever ready for war. A war even against their own citizens, against their own communities, because you never know what might happen. I've been following several of the questions about school resource officers. There are benefits to having police officers present in our communities and present in schools, but riding on but you never know, something might happen, so let's have them armed to the teeth and let's have them check everyone and do that physically, aggressively. We need to think about the consequences of that. I hope that provides a on-target answer.
Yes, thank you both. I appreciate you, and I'm sure our audience have appreciated you and the information that you've provided. We are certainly grateful, this panel as a whole, for having had the opportunity. As we close out, I would ask you all to also keep in mind that there are many people who have not walked into the, that did not start off with defunding perspectives or in favor of defunding or abolition, but they have been brought along, and they've been brought along on the heels of of countless killings that continue to happen. And they have also been brought along, and I will tell you, as a person who's been on the receiving end of state violence in the street, as America have sat and watched the footage time and time again with no one coming for the rescue. Those kinds of experiences, the heat of it, the worst end of it, when you know the world is watching and there's no intervention in real time, those kinds of things have also worked to move people along in a very fundamental way in terms of defunding. And I will leave this last thing. I once heard an educator, and many of us are educators, but I once heard someone say that they have been working for decades with defunding in education. They've had to figure out how to navigate class after class, groups of students after students. So those are the kinds of perspectives and things that people are thinking about and working with as they have experienced defunding in their careers, outside of law enforcement, and defunding in their communities, divestment and disinvestment in more ways than we can imagine. And so on that note, we wish you all well and much safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you, everyone.